Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hey, this Jungian Life listeners, this is Joseph Lee. I'm just going to take a second to ask you to do us a favor. Stop by iTunes, subscribe, and leave us a review. We're at a place in the development of our podcast where that would be tremendously helpful, and we'd appreciate your help.
So today's episode is something that it certainly comes up a lot in my practice. Comes up for people, a lot of friends that have gone through this. It's a very common experience to be in a relationship and to be wondering whether you should stay in the relationship or is it time to leave. It really calls up this larger question of how does one make a decision like this? And it can be very painful to try to sit with this. So we thought we'd try to talk about it.
What I'm thinking about is that the title of the podcast of Should I Stay or Should I Go sort of frames it as a binary type of decision, one or the other. And which one will it be? Whereas I think often in reality, this really calls for a long or long enough exploration of what is going on in the person who's questioning the relationship and in the relationship itself in order to come to a decision that has wholeness in it and that has a kind of clarity to it, and to take time with that.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, Deb, what I'm hearing is the importance of the process. And I do think that any significant decision that we make, we usually, if it feels, look, sometimes you need to make a big decision. It's just very clear what you want to do. But if it's less than clear, then having some kind of process around that decision is really protective, I think, of regret later on. Because you can, if you think, oh God, should I really have married this person, or should I really have divorced this person, or whatever, you can think, well, okay, I had a process. I looked at it all very carefully. I sat with myself. I talked to some people I trust. Whatever it is, you can look back and say, I really did my homework on this. And so wherever I am, I can feel good about it.
Yeah, you need to have a story, a narrative that you can live with after you make an enormous change like that.
Yeah.
And in order to have a story that you can live with, that you really have to explore it. But I want to jump backwards in time a little bit, that what starts the change process is that somebody's in a relationship and there's the image, impulse, energy to leave the relationship is discovered inside of one of the persons, that the marital or relationship fantasy, the fantasy of union and harmony and joy, or whatever ways that it's being held, now includes a new ingredient, which is the leaving. And when I think about the idea of leaving, being the one who is contemplating leaving, that brings up a lot of internal imagery for me and a lot of feeling in myself. And I can think of how powerful that is when that manifests. And one of the things that people will confess in a session is, I never thought I'd want to leave. I just never considered that this could come up, but here it is. And it's an incredible confession. I can't believe 3 years into the marriage, I'm having these fantasies of leaving and living on my own, or these other kinds of dynamics that are demanding attention because they've shown themselves in the psyche. And that's the beginning of the rumblings.
Yeah, that can be really hard to admit.
So I'm back on your word about something has changed in the relationship. that before we get to the place of should I stay or should I go, I would be interested in what has changed for you in this relationship, and how much of it is that person's own perhaps new direction in life, a set of new interests, libido has gone into something new, and how much of it is in the relationship of I want something to change with this person, and it hasn't changed, and I'm frustrated with this person.
Well, and sometimes when I've worked with people in this situation, when I query them along those lines, Deb, what I hear is, I've been unhappy with this relationship from the beginning. If I'm being honest with myself, I wasn't even sure I wanted to get married or whatever. So sometimes when someone comes in with a question like this, I'll say, "Well, tell me what it was like, in the early days of the relationship, and how did you feel on if it's a marriage?" I'll say, "What was your wedding day like?" And a certain number of people who are contemplating leaving, even decades into the marriage, will say, I wasn't excited. I kind of knew it was a mistake. So it can be this sense of having always felt like something wasn't quite right and having worked really hard to reconcile yourself with it and then finally not being able to do so anymore.
So the story of the relationship, the original narrative, the picture of the staying is already involves some kind of a tension or a deficit that hasn't felt like a full conjoining, a full marriage. And there's evidence of that as the person begins to confess it.
Yes, it feels like I'm finally being honest. That it can feel like that. It can. I think when you're thinking about leaving a long-term relationship, there are clearly those cases in which it's just very obvious that that's what needs to happen, and often that involves, there's been flagrant infidelity, or there's been abusive behavior or a real kind of betrayal in terms of, maybe money or drugs and alcohol or something like that. And it feels fairly obvious what needs to happen. But for many people where there isn't such an egregious uh, kind of crossing of a line, it can be really agonizing because it's so clearly not one thing. This is a person maybe who you've never really felt close to, but who's been in your life for 4 decades, and you've raised kids together, and he's maybe never you maybe feel like he's never understood you, but he's also never strayed, and he's always kind of been a stalwart partner. And so what do you do with that? And the truth is, I don't know that there is. It seems to me in most of these cases, there isn't a right answer. And so it is this process of kind of careful discernment and figuring out kind of what it would mean to stay and what it would mean to leave. And what does the self with a capital S want, which is really not so easy to figure out all the time.
Well, when I hear you saying that, Lisa, what it evokes for me is a developmental kind of crisis, an almost existential realization in one of the partners that they actually are free, that they are free human beings, and that they may have stumbled into the marriage, but at some point they have to realize that they have to choose to be in the marriage, and that nothing external is compelling them to be married. And if they originally stumbled unconsciously into the marriage and then wake up and realize that they're free beings and not just stumbling through life, then there's a process that didn't happen in the beginning that now must happen in consciousness.
Well, I'm thinking in a way that we all sort of stumble into a marriage, that there's so much about choosing a partner and committing to a partner that we know very incompletely at the beginning of a marriage, even if we've been with that person for maybe living together for some period of time. And that there are different marriages to the same person as time goes on. The newly falling in love, the honeymoon, proverbial honeymoon stage, perhaps a child rearing stage, career development stage, householding, and so it goes. And that process of discernment, like that word, Lisa, is very important. Of, do I need to change in this marriage, my partner and I together, to move into a different marriage with the same partner? Or is this relationship simply over in some way?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely point, Deb, that we all kind of stumble blindly into a relationship, really, whether it's a marriage or just a longer term relationship.
Yeah, I got married when I was 25, and believe me, there was a lot of stumbling into it because, how conscious are we of so much of ourselves in life at age 25 or 30 or 60?
And I think it raises this point that there's this way that being in a marriage that's still green in some way, that isn't completely ossified, does almost require continually recommitting ourselves to it. Joseph, this is to your point about kind of waking up and realizing you're free. And the truth is we are always free, right? We could at any time, any of us could choose to leave the relationship we're currently in. There's a way that we're continually needing to confront that and sort of redecide to stay in the relationship.
Yes, that there's a way in which even each morning we wake and we choose to continue to be married or continue to be partnered as a function of the human soul, and that we really are choosing to remain married. And when the magnitude of that reality lands on someone, they are in this place of leaving or staying once they realize that they are free beings. And that choice is always actually in their hands. Now, the evaluation of whether one would stay or go, and what you had said earlier, that normally for that question to even arise, that something is either lost from the original marital fantasy and or something painful has been introduced. And then there's a bit of a kind of cost benefit evaluation that's going on in the psyche. Can this infraction, whether it's infidelity or some other painful event has now emerged in the relationship dynamic, is the pain of that, working through that, worth what I think is valuable about the relationship? And that kind of a economic model sometimes is the beginning of an evaluative process.
Yeah, I'm thinking about having to work through the inevitable withdrawing of one's projections on the partner. And there's also always a contract that's usually unspoken when two people get married or decide to have a committed relationship, of that you will do this part of the relationship and I'm going to do that part. That used to be taken for granted in the Ozzie and Harriet days of, what the woman's role was, what the man's role is, and that the other person is going to complete me, is going to fulfill my hopes and dreams. And so part of it is the disappointment and how we deal with conflict when we inevitably are confronted with the task of loving another very real person with faults and foibles just like the ones we have, rather than my hope and my dream of what life with you was going to be like.
So that stage where the fantasy material begins to lose energy that had originally fueled the passion of coupling, and those initial images begin to soften, lose energy, and then there's this question of what's left, or how does one build something that is worth staying for?
I don't know your experiences are in the consulting room, but very often for me with couples, difficulty comes with the child rearing stage. Everybody is working very, very hard all the time and giving to the kids. I've lived in Brooklyn, New York, and oftentimes both partners have jobs outside the home and birthday parties for the kids on the weekends and swimming lessons, and it goes on. And it's a period of very, very hard work where there isn't a lot of energy just for the relationship because everyone is too tired and too worn down and too busy. And that the energy then seems to leave the marriage because there's nobody there to do the refueling.
Yeah, that no one's kind of tending to each other or the relationship because they're so busy tending to their careers and their kids. For me, I've also seen this come up actually after the kids leave because there can be a sense of, at least we're involved in this kind of common project of raising the kids, and there are these couple of decades maybe where there's things are somewhat stable, where his career is advancing and maybe she's focused on the kids if that's kind of the contract, and then the kids leave, and the basis upon which the couple worked, it's like we were good raising kids together, but then like then you're sort of in an empty house staring at each other going, wow, what do we do now, and kind of trying to reconnect with what was there 20 or 30 years before the kids came. That can be really difficult for people. And of course, the decision to leave at that point is often includes this sobering look at what's it going to be like to be alone at 50 or 60 or even older.
So to me, that rings of the question: which archetypal dynamic is dominating the relationship? So, for instance, when people first meet, it's often the archetype of the lover has been constellated, and the great passionate exchange. With the birth of children and child rearing, the archetype of parenting, being the mother, being the father, the archetype of the child is all dominating the relationship, often for many more years than the romance was. The romance might have been 2 or 3 years, and then there's kids there for maybe 19 or 20 years. And once the kids leave, there's this question of what will the guiding paradigm be in this, third stage? And if nothing comes in to fill that lifelessness, nothing comes in to provide a role for the individuals, they're kind of lost at sea, at least for a while. And that's a precarious place for a couple to be in.
I think managing a twosome is one of the most difficult tasks in life. And for all the hard work and busyness and all the rest of it of raising children, they do provide a mutual sort of focus and a link, a ready-made link for the two parents. But hopefully, I think that when the proverbial empty nest has arrived, that both parents have also really grown in their own personhood. They've had interests, they've had learning opportunities, they may both have careers, and have, one hopes, more skills and more sense of themselves to use in reconnecting with one another in a new way, in their 40s or 50s or even now in their 60s. I am bringing, I hope, to this relationship much more of me. I've been busy these 20 or 25 or 30 years while we were raising kids together. I have more to offer.
Yeah, that's a lovely image, and I think it requires an ability for the partners to be able to be newly vulnerable to each other, which can be difficult because I think that there's this. I think about this sometimes, that we have a relationship persona. You know, I mean, the truth is that if you're in a marriage or you're cohabitating, you have this kind of partnered life. There's so much daily interaction that's like, did you see that your W-2 form came in the mail? We've got to get to the taxes kind of thing. Or gosh, it's time to take out the compost. Would you mind doing it? Or whatever. There's all
The
this.
business of the relationship. Yeah.
The business, and it means that we have like a marriage persona, and that could come to predominate so much that it's there are these kind of this carapace of defensiveness perhaps between the two people, especially if there's been conflict or resentment or disappointment. And after decades of that building up without being scraped off, it can be very hard to kind of find one another again.
Yeah, I liked what you said, Lisa. I resonated to being open, being vulnerable, and being able to share oneself with your partner. To say, here's what my inner world is like. Here's what I think about. Here's what I'm concerned about. Here's my new dream. Here's what I'd like to have happen. And that openness and willingness to be undefended and to be vulnerable, I think, is hugely important all along the line. And that is a skill that is hard to acquire, and it can kind of have to be sidelined during those busy years of raising children.
I want to pick up on this idea about sort of growth, Deb, that you're talking about, and being open to kind of new growth in the relationship, to just maybe walk around it in a slightly different way. And Jung was very interested in what he called the final or teleological perspective. Like, he was not only interested in kind of where things had come from, but he was really interested in which way they were tending. It's like, where does the energy want to go? What does the psyche want from us? And is it sometimes the case that sometimes the psyche wants us to leave a relationship that it perhaps has felt too constricting, or that we've had to kind of, cut off part of ourself to be in, or kind of edit ourself to in too restricted a way, and that the psyche does call for us to leave. I mean, I do think that can be the case, and perhaps part of the work of trying to decide, should I stay or should I go, is what's being asked for here, for me to grow in new ways in this relationship, or is the only way that I can stretch into myself to leave it? And it's not always so easy to know.
So when a client's in the office and they're coming forward with this idea of needing to leave the relationship, one of the questions that I'll explore with them is, can they find a place in themselves where they can believe that they create the relationship and that they have or can find the tools and inner resources necessary to create the relationship? Or are they fixed in the position that the relationship only happens spontaneously and mysteriously? And if people are in that kind of spontaneous emergence of the relationship, then they'll often feel if something is missing, it's just gone. And it's mysterious, it's inscrutable, and there's really nothing I can do about it. And so they're kind of evaluating the marriage from a standpoint of passivity and mystery, as if it's all really out of their hands. So I find people fall into one of those two categories.
So say more about that, because that's really interesting to me. I mean, I think certainly people do often feel like what happens in the relationship isn't necessarily under their control. So just lay that out a little bit more for me, Joseph.
So here's a couple of scenarios. One might be that a fairly young, appealing couple, they've been married a few years and devoid of any trauma, that their sex life just evaporates. And as I'm talking to my client, a woman, and I'm encouraging her to initiate sex more frequently or to initiate it at all in order to kind of rouse passion. And this is after sex has been gone for 4 years. There's this feeling that there's nothing she can do. He just won't respond. And anyway, I shouldn't have to do this. He's the guy. He's supposed to be pursuing me. And I can think of many other men who would passionately, pursue me. And all of this kind of obstruction, as I try to help her move towards the idea of creating the sexual crucible, and a kind of fixity in the position that if it doesn't happen spontaneously between us, then this isn't really a marriage.
And so what would you say to someone who's struggling really hard, trying to have multiple difficult conversations with a partner, uh, to let him know, for example, that she doesn't feel seen or heard, and they've tried each going to therapy individually. They're considering couples counseling. Would that kind of fall into your passivity, or are you thinking of something really different?
Well, when I think of this idea of being caught in the idea that the relationship should spontaneously emerge at all times, I'm not hearing people being willing to experiment in the relationship, to discover what their agency is in terms of creating the dynamics that they want. But in the scenario that you had mentioned, I would suggest that both partners need to be observed together in a clinical space to also be able to compare what the observable behavior is versus what the narrative is that they just bring into their individual therapists in order to discern whether the blocks are insurmountable.
Yeah, one of the things that your paradigm brings up for me, Joseph, is that sometimes, and I think this probably happens more with women, sometimes women will come in and what they'll say is their complaints about the relationship are fairly vague. I'm not saying they're not serious or substantial, but it's not like we don't have physical intimacy anymore or he just seems checked out. It's more like, I just don't feel like he really understands me. And I find that this is more likely to occur in a relationship where the woman may have had a narcissistic mother. So there was probably a real wound there to begin with of just not often feeling seen or heard. And that there may be perhaps, a very big expectation in the marriage relationship that something will be there that wasn't there, in infancy and early childhood, of course, completely unconsciously. And so where there are kind of empathic failures, where he is just kind of, a little bit thick-headed and he doesn't really see that such and such is so important to her, that she doesn't know exactly how to kind of ring the bell and say, "Look, I need you to pay attention. This matters to me." She has trouble kind of advocating for herself, but it feels deeply, deeply, deeply wounding because she just feels kind of invisible.
I think of this as the of establishing emotional literacy for both people in the partnership, of how to find the words to say it, and also the development of real listening ability. That my wife or my husband, my partner, is trying to articulate a need, a desire, a feeling, and to bring that into worded consciousness. And some of it is communication and skill development, as well as, the deeper feelings of intimacy and restoring a felt sense of connection.
So, Deb, when I'm listening to what you had said, that there's a vision that we often have as analysts of skills, relationship skills and behaviors that would likely restore at least intimacy or restore a flow of communication. And one of the things that I find very challenging is the impediments that people have in their psyches to embracing those skills. And often it shows up for me as we're going deeper and deeper in the analysis as these certain places of intractable stubbornness.
Or complexes.
Yeah, and I hear this in both men and women. They'll be telling me the narrative of the story, and of course, you hold everything 50-50. The client wants you to sympathize with them. So often the other spouse is demonized to some degree, and the client in the room is blameless. So once we're kind of sorting all of that down, and the rubber meets the road in terms of what would you need to provide to at least see if there's a way to revive something that you're longing for. And I inevitably hear all of these kinds of psycho-spiritual places that people just refuse to go. I'm not doing that. And that I have found that in almost every case where someone has clung to the idea of leaving as the solution,
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when people bring this into therapy, they really kind of already decided that they wanna leave, and that may be part of it.
Yeah. They've gone before they've gone.
I wanna just take this in a slightly different direction. I'm thinking in particular of Jung, actually, who had his own difficulties in his marriage, and he has an essay in volume 17 entitled Marriage as a Psychological Relationship, and he talks about how it's possible to be married in this very unconscious way, just kind of, doing the instinctual thing and, not really have a kind of conscious relationship with your partner, but that sort of breaking out of that and becoming more conscious can be necessary hard work. And he has this great quote. He says, "Seldom or never does a marriage develop into an individual relationship smoothly and without crises. There is no birth of consciousness without pain." So I think what he's getting at here is that the hard work of staying in the conflict, holding the tension of the opposites, suffering this a little bit can be beneficial in that it helps one become more conscious both individually and in the relationship.
So, if we were to bring that back to our title of Should I Stay or Should I Go, that the staying requires certain psychospiritual capacities, and one of them is to suffer growth. Do you have the mettle to grow in such a way that the marriage can flourish?
To hold it as a challenge for yourself rather than only a challenge with your partner. And that is very often what comes into the consulting room is that I have a relational problem with my partner, which is true. And there's also a relational problem with oneself of how much anxiety can I hold? How much tension can I stand? And what is my own personal growth challenge here?
You know, Deb, that's a great point, and what it brings up for me is the way that intimate relationships bring up our complexes like nothing else. And so a lot of times when there's, sort of a seemingly intractable problem in a marriage, what's really going on is that we're sort of being danced by our complexes. Often where we wind up marrying someone with a kind of complementary complex to our own. So for example, if we're very afraid of being abandoned, we might wind up marrying someone who is very afraid of being engulfed, and these would relate to the nature of the early childhood parental complexes, for example, perhaps.
Yes. And that I would say is a very common kind of pattern
Yes.
that one person is much more fearful of emotional abandonment, not so much always literal abandonment, and the other is much more afraid of being subsumed and being forced to comply and give up a sense of individuality.
Right. And so going back to our title, as Joseph reminded us a minute ago, it's like one of the questions maybe when deciding whether to stay or go is there a way that when this goes off the rails, when we get into these terrible arguments, let's say, that I'm acting out, I'm acting from this complexed place. And if so, can I bear to try to work through that either by myself or with my partner so that then I have this really growthful experience of kind of transforming a complex and perhaps perhaps also finding my way to being able to relate to my partner in a way that I can really enjoy what's good there without it being constantly spoiled by the complex.
And that's a huge process of discernment of how much of the problem is between me and how much of it is between me and you. That takes real time and attention to kind of identify which parts are ours and which parts are in the relationship.
I'm sitting with that question, Deb, and I think actually that discernment, I think, happens in stages. I'm just thinking about my own clinical experience that there often needs to be a stage where the client needs to assume that every intense experience that they are having of the marriage is being generated from their own psyche. That stance has to be taken strongly in order for them to really march into their own psychological life with this determination to discover the mysteries, and particularly to unpack the disruptive memories and often traumas inside of them that are informing the relationship. And I think people have to go through that kind of purification process where they're kind of scouring their own pots, so to speak, in their internal kitchen before they can then have a hope of objectively being able to assess what the other person is bringing to the marriage.
It's a very big process of where is the conflict? Is it internal or is it interpersonal?
And of course, there's a way that those two things can really overlap. It's like they feed each other.
And that takes me back to the Jungian principle of being able to hold the tension because it's not clear. It is difficult. It's challenging. There's a lot of feeling in it. And the willingness to engage with oneself and one's partner and possibly a therapist takes a lot of ability to be willing to manage all those anxieties. And I would say that is really the beginning and the alpha and omega of all of this is, am I willing to really manage all these anxieties and the complexities and to hold all those tensions in order to have a full process and achieve the discernment that will give me clarity. It is a real purification. It's a real trial by fire. And I think it's worth it. It's not as if there's a should in here that you should stay or you should go, but you should come to a clarity about your own knowing.
Yeah, and when someone comes to me trying to make a big decision like this or perhaps another one, I will often say, my wish for you at the end of this process is to have clarity. Clarity is different than than certainty. Certainty, I think, is often actually kind of defensive, especially if it's around a major issue that you might expect to have complex feelings about. Well, I just have to leave. This kind of, you jump to that kind of quickly, and the certainty kind of forecloses the difficulty of ambivalence. This kind of excruciating, agonizing, like, what is the right thing to do? But Deb, like you were saying, I mean, I think if you really go through this process, hopefully at the end of it, you have this sense of clarity. And that sets you up well to go on to the next stage and be able to suffer whatever disappointments there are, because there will be just, if you've come to a crux in a relationship where you think you either need to stay or go, and you have this process, and then you make a decision one way or the other, you will have to suffer disappointment. You will have to suffer the disappointment of staying with the spouse and not being able to pursue some of the things that you might have hoped you could pursue if you left the marriage. You might have to suffer leaving the marriage and recognizing that you're not going to magically find the perfect other who will kind of bring you happiness where your other partner failed. But having gone through a process and found clarity, you'll be better able to manage those disappointments.
Yes, the strength to be able to suffer and stay in the relationship is, I think, an essential ingredient of being able to stay and not flee. Another scenario that I'm thinking of in terms of the staying or going, which happens in midlife, I can think of many circumstances where somebody begins to feel that the person that they have been in the marriage is inauthentic. They didn't even know it. And that a more authentic image of oneself is emerging and pressing on the individual and pressing for an opportunity to be expressed. And I have seen people go through stages of desperately wanting to flee because the emergence of the real self after all these years feels shameful to them. It's as if they have been inadvertently tricking everyone around them, and that for them to claim their true stance would require fleeing from everyone who knew them in their old and false self, and to have to manufacture a whole new environment in order to receive the authentic self that wants to emerge.
Well, and sometimes if that is the case, it can be difficult to bring forward the authentic self in a relationship where the partner expects you to be as you always were.
Which in a sense is true, because if that's the only version of the personality that the partner has ever known, and we do have an expectation for some kind of continuity in the life, that yes, the spouse would be expecting you to be the same person you were a week ago. And there is absolute tension is going to arise when you begin introducing this new person that's coming up inside of you.
That goes to my idea about recontracting of what is our relationship about and moving into the next stage, or not, but the next stage of a marriage is I'm not the person that I was 10 years ago. Maybe the original contract was, for one person to be more passive and to be more of a follower or a supporter of the other person. And then what happens when that person sort of gets hold of his or her own sense of direction or ambition or a new life interest? How do we deal with that? How do we hold that tension that we have a conflict here? And how are we going to navigate this or not?
Well, and one thing that I'm aware of is when one person presses for growth and changes, there is a tendency for the other person to want to make the person go back the way they were before. But if the partnership can stretch and allow the one partner to grow, that often presents a real growth opportunity for the other partner as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, something's demanded. Yeah.
hmm And that can be, there can be in many tremendous individuation opportunities within a marriage.
We really rub against one another in a marriage or a partnership. And I think it comes down to whether we can hold that rubbing, the tension, the anxiety as a way of refining ourselves and our partnership, or whether it becomes a destructive force. Can we use it for personal growth and mutual growth? Can we make it work for us of rubbing off one another's rough edges? Or does it become an attacking, destructive conflict?
And the truth is, it probably moves through all of those stages in more or less nuanced ways or more or less explicit ways. But there is a definite wrestling that happens as the two partners come to understand what's trying to emerge and how they're going to orient towards it. I want to toss out one other dimension that I see in my practice about should I stay or should I go, is the emergence of a fantasy of pleasure that somehow the individual cannot tolerate landing in the marriage. So a middle aged man begins to feel like is a world of wild sexual dynamism that's out there somewhere away from the marriage and fed by regular use of pornography, reinforced by frequent periods, extended periods of masturbation, and self-talk around this can create an incredibly libidinized image of kind of pleasure, a pleasure palace that kind of lives somewhere else, but it's not the marital relationship. And the decision to leave becomes an almost kind of hypnotic march towards the pleasure palace of one kind or another. I have seen this happen with women, but I more often see it with men, particularly around between 40 and 50 years old.
Yeah, that sounds almost kind of dissociative or highly defensive or something, where there's a real kind of splitting off from kind of reality and fleeing a flight into fantasy is what it sounds to me like.
It could be. It could be a flight into fantasy, but some of these men will go to extraordinary lengths to be able to manifest these experiences. And because the psyche is charging them with so much internal libido, it makes these extramarital adventures carry an enormous amount of power, which makes the marriage seem even more drab. That's a really tricky thing to negotiate in this should I stay or should I go?
How do you work with that?
Well, one, I try to contract with my clients that they will not make a massive life decision while they are in analysis. That because the analytic process can stir so much unconscious, potent imagery, that I want to protect them from being swept away by it. So, one of it can be an explicit agreement that major life changes are not going to be acted on until we have a sense that the analysis is moving towards a concluding place. The other is I work heavily with dreams and hope, sometimes pray, that the part of the client psyche that creates dreams will offer a kind of corrective imagery that will allow us to begin to talk about the inflation around the idea of the pleasure palace. I think another important element is to work to restore an experience in the client of the psychological reality of their partner. Because when somebody is caught in the leaving, and particularly the fleeing to the pleasure palace, there's a way in which I always see the wife being turned into a two-dimensional object. And so finding opportunities to reanimate the person's perception of the wife as a complicated human being who is functioning on multiple levels is another way to at least restore a greater sense of reality around it.
So, in a way, I'm thinking that we're kind of elaborating on the idea of one person having a kind of abandonment complex, which you referenced earlier, Lisa, of, when a woman can come in and say, I just don't feel seen or understood. And then the other person having the impulse to leave, to seek the pleasure palace, as you call it, Joseph, of how to work that very typical kind of conflict between men and women, where the woman wants more emotional closeness, more connection, more communication, and that for the male, libido may be more sexualized and physical, may go in that direction psychologically. And how do two people resolve that? Not at all an unusual pattern, I think, between men and women, especially in midlife.
I wanna just lift up something we touched on earlier, but it feels important to say again, I think, is that we are talking about the necessity of sort of suffering the tension, of managing the conflict, of sort of sitting with this and containing it and having a process. And I sometimes I do think it's the right thing to leave. It's not, I mean, there's real value in trying to stay in the relationship and see what can be, in other words, not fleeing too quickly from conflict and seeing what there might be to learn, what we can learn about ourselves even in a relationship. And sometimes I think the self is asking us to leave.
So if for me, it's the end of the process, if it's a complete enough process, isn't whether one stays or goes, but how one has come to the decision to either stay or go. Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work. But producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you. Today's dream is from a woman who's 28 years old, and she is an engineer. And the dream is, I feel chunks missing from my molars on the bottom left and spit it out into my hand. It's 3 pieces of different teeth plus 1 full tooth. I look in the mirror, and there is no tooth missing, but the broken pieces match up. My mouth is like Gollum's, and my teeth in front are shifted right and are thin and pointed like vampire teeth. And she says about her life situation that she feels like life has been grabbing her and she's been grabbing life by the horns in a way that she hasn't done previously. She's being more assertive and asking for what she wants at work and not being afraid to try new things and meet new people. And she had this dream on her mother's birthday and felt surprise at every step of the dream's narrative.
Well, teeth are certainly a common thing to dream about.
Yes.
What do we think of tooth dreams?
I just go to a very literal place right off the bat, which is what are teeth? What are they for? What do we do with them? And the sort of the bipolar place of we need them obviously to chew with and to masticate our food and start the digestive process and assimilate. And we also use them aggressively. We bite into things and we use verbal expressions that way. We talk about, boy, this is really feeding me, or I really bit down on that. So there's a lot of tooth and mouth references and imagery just in our human condition, I think.
Yeah, it certainly kind of carries this image of our aggressive capacity, doesn't it? To be assertive, to bite into things. One of the things that I notice about this dream is that there's 3 pieces of different teeth, and then there's 1 full tooth. And the full tooth is a little bit of a mystery because when she looks in the mirror, there is no tooth missing. So the broken pieces seem to, if I'm reading this correctly, it's almost like the broken pieces have enabled her teeth to become pointier.
Yes. She says they have shifted to the right and are thin and pointed like vampire teeth. Now, there is a really aggressive image.
Mm-hmm.
Vampire teeth are pointed so that they can pierce the veins and allow the blood to flow.
So something's changed in her, that she's developed these kinds of predator teeth, the canine teeth, which will allow her to bite or fight in a more ferocious way, perhaps.
Although interestingly, the reference to Gollum brings up something very different. Because although Gollum is sort of, predatory, there's the scene where he's catching the fish and, he's very kind of animal. He is ultimately furtive and gets what he wants by sneaking and hiding being invisible, stealing. So it's an interesting image to go along with this feeling of I'm becoming more assertive, I'm getting what I want, I'm biting into things, because it's almost like maybe it feels there's a way that it's not quite allowed and this has to be done furtively.
And there's a kind of maiming here with these broken, jagged teeth, as I'm imagining them. So that here's this assertiveness, and yet here's a very unattractive looking set of teeth. They're broken, they're jagged. So it feels to me, in a broad way, that this coming to terms with aggression may be a very important process that she's going through of, is it really okay? Is it assertive and healthy? Or is there something in the unconscious that says, whoa, I haven't really quite made my peace with this yet. And teeth are also our persona. I'm thinking about all the ads on TV for Invisalign braces and dental implants, and how important it is to have a nice, bright, white smile. And so the persona aspect of her teeth is, clearly not in that kind of benign kind of modality here. She's got broken, jagged teeth, not the kind of teeth you want to smile with.
Yes. So when I think about that, Deb, and I also just think about Gollum's appearance in the movie, that I am wondering whether some part of her is concerned that she looks grotesque in some way as she's conducting this experiment of being more assertive and having more agency in her life. But then I think that, dreams are telling us something that we don't know about ourselves, something that the ego isn't aware of. And she's aware that she's grabbing life by the horns, asking for what she wants, and she's being brave. But then the dream is giving this image of something inside of her that she would normally rely on to chew and metabolize are actually broken down, that she is not as potent as she thought she was, that the bones in the mouth, the teeth, are actually much more brittle and much more fragile than she would perhaps be given to think of herself as she's going about in this highly assertive new expression.
Yeah, and if you think about it, a broken tooth that can be a real problem, right? Depending on how the break is, how deep into the tooth it goes, that can be a real vulnerability.
I'm also aware that she says she had this dream on her mother's birthday. Dreams often do reflect something right about the most immediate or current life situation. If I were in the room with her, I would want to know more about her relationship with her mother.
I also want to just look at the fact that she's 28 years old, and in kind of conventional astrology, that around the 28th year, we have our first major Saturn return. And in astrology, that often signifies a deep internal pressure to confront our unlived life. In that way, when I think of her spitting the teeth out, I have another fantasy, which is kind of losing your baby teeth. And that is she moving through a developmental process where something old is getting loose and falling out of her mouth, and in preparation for perhaps getting her grown up teeth in, her adult teeth coming in. And I could see that happening, psychologically at between 28 years old and moving into your 30s.
Absolutely. That kind of age 30 transition. Yeah, and that idea I think kind of fits with this notion that she spits out a tooth, but then there's not a tooth missing. It's like it's kind of already been replaced or something, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if I had the streamer here, I would want to check in again about feeling. She mentioned surprise, so it's a surprising thing that happens. But does she look in the mirror and think, "Wow, this is really cool. I look like a vampire," or is it a little bit horrifying? And I'd be curious about some of the emotional tone of this dream, because I think it could give us a clue as to a little bit how to orient to it more.
I think her association with her mouth looking like Gollum's gives us a certain tone to it. But Gollum evolves in the movie. I mean, he can seem like a despot at times. He seems like a victim at other times, and then looks like a traumatized child in other parts of the movie.
But he never really is empowered.
No, he's tortured, always pursuing the ring of power.
Yeah.
And when she talks about grabbing life by the horns, grabbing the brass ring is another way of saying it. Is the psyche perhaps a little troubled by the power complex that might be rising in the psyche? And then she has a compensatory dream where Gollum becomes this figure who has been really ruined by the power complex symbolized by the ring, and that also has become somewhat grotesque, being enslaved to the power of the ring. This could also be, a cautionary, and this fear that she will somehow become tremendously unattractive if she continues to move in a power dynamic.
So there's a lot of ambivalence, we might say, about her relationship toward power, taking life by the horns, asking for what she wants. That the conscious position is what she says, that she's doing these things and is has a tone of being pleased with this, but the unconscious is in a very different position here. It's expressing doubts. Is it really okay? What if I wind up looking like Gollum? What if I have vampire teeth? Something being worked out in the psyche between conscious ego position and the unconscious.
Yeah, I think that's just it, Deb. The dream sort of just shows this ambivalence, and I don't know that we know kind of which way things are tending, but it's just a statement of ambivalence.
I think so. I'm captured a little bit by having this dream on her mother's birthday. So ostensibly, the mother's birthday happens that night. She goes home and has the dream that her teeth are falling out and she's a golem-like looking creature. And I'm wondering if this is some part of the mother complex, that this unresolved feeling that she has of being Gollum-like in the presence of the mother. And if we think about Gollum and his incredible unmet needs and this kind of wailing and crying and rage and pleasure, that he really is kind of like a terrible two's child in Lord of the Rings with this incredibly powerful and dangerous body. So the dream can also be a symbol of a regression back to a powerfully uncomfortable young need that's unmet and is held as deeply unattractive in the family system, and deeply unattractive perhaps by the mother complex, if not the biological mother.
Yeah, that would be certainly something interesting to explore with this streamer if we had her with us.
And I'm just thinking generally that unmet needs can become unattractive and Gollum-like. I mean, we see it with kids when they whine, but I want this, I don't want that. And that we do turn into this sort of unattractive place when a legitimate protest or articulated need has not been received.
Oh, that's a good point, Deb.
And I would be curious about the family system too. And is there an unmet need or a protest that was not honored?
Yeah, it's like our needs get reflected back to us as something ugly or grotesque.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.